Suspension tuning is widely regarded as a black art, but it doesn't have to be. This is the Annex Suspension Podcast. This is Tyler with Annex Suspension Group, and today the topic of discussion is camber change on roll. Starting off, let's just quickly define what camber is. Camber is the tilt of the wheel inwards or outwards from the center line of the vehicle. So most tuner cars these days have adjustable suspension, whether it's from parts that have been added or an aftermarket suspension. And what's really popular in certain types of builds is large amounts of static negative camber. That's when you get that, shock of 10, that big sideways stretch. But there's two different types of camber. You have it in both static, which is a hard fixed setting, and if it's dynamic, as it's changing, or like the topic we're trying to cover, during roll. Roll is something that happens when you're getting an on-ramp, getting on an off-ramp, whenever the car's weight is shifted to one side, causing that side to lean. Realistically, camber is always going to be adjusted for its dynamic state, meaning you'll put it to a static setting to achieve something while it's being dynamic, rolling. Most aftermarket suspension setups come with a way to tune camber, whether that's a set of coilovers, a set of control arms, or even just aftermarket bolts. It gives you a way to dial it in or out. Most of the time that's just for factory alignment settings. Some cars even have it built in. A good case of that is a lot of Miatas have eccentric bolts that let you adjust it right on the car. Either way, your suspension type is going to dictate a lot of either how much camber you need or how much adjustment you can get. Most cars today use a McPherson strut style suspension, whether that's your S chassis, most of your Honda chassis, any of these tuning cars, the Twins, the FRS, the BRZ, all the way back to 80s cars between the Corollas, the RX-7s, all these cars use struts. So it's very common to see that in cars that we're modifying to handle for more grip. The key important thing about a strut style suspension is that on compression, while it's rolling, you will lose camber. It's going to start off at its static setting and then decrease the more the car rolls. It's one of the reasons why a sway bar upgrade is super popular. Less roll, less camber loss. But it still means that you're going to have a high amount of static camber so that when you get on that turn hard, you don't lose all of your negative camber and therefore all of your grip during the turn. So, if we're adjusting it, why do we want negative camber? Again, that's the top of the wheel tilted in towards the center line of the car and the bottom of the wheel tilted out. The whole point of negative camber is that as the car rolls onto that side, onto that wheel, the contact patch of the tire at the bottom stays in contact with the ground. The more of the contact patch that stays in contact with the ground, the more grip you have, meaning more speed you can carry. The point is, if a car rolls, what happens? As that camber change becomes dynamic, you either gain or lose that static camber setting based on the type of suspension that you have. So there's two other suspension types that are fairly common in cars that people are tuning for motorsports activities. The first being double A-arm or double wishbone suspension. Honestly, this is most commonly found on early 90s era Honda cars. It's used in other things as well, but this is when you have both an upper and lower control arm that are set in a way that the car will actually gain camber while lowering the height or while rolling. So a very common modification is to immediately drop those cars to a much lower overall ride height and no other change needs to be made. Now, as that car rolls, there is a small amount of camber that it will gain, and then it will run out. And then that dynamic amount stops, and you will continue to roll, and that's all that it has. But the inherent advantage of this type of suspension is that typically a height change is all the car needs to dramatically increase grip. It also is regarded as the best type of suspension for racing activities. It's what you used to see on Formula One cars until further development later on. The other type of suspension that's very common is a multi-link suspension type. What's most interesting about the multi-link type is it actually combines elements of the other two suspensions. Realistically speaking, the best way to find out what kind of camber change occurs with that suspension type is to put an angle gauge on the vehicle and move the suspension through its range of motion. That way, finding out is there gain or is there loss, and to what degree during the travel. With a multi-link suspension, there's so many things that can affect and change it. It's always better to do the test and find out, and that way you'll know, rather than guess or base on assumptions of what other people may say.
Awesome. So Tyler, let's say we have 3 different customers, each one with the suspension type that you listed. So one is a strut car, one is a double wishbone, and then one is a multi-link. All 3 planned for either track use or, doing canyon carving. So how would I go about determining what would be the best camber setting per different type of suspension setup that my vehicle has?
The first and most important part is going to be the type of suspension you have, but you also have to keep in mind the tire. Tires also have a sweet spot that they'll operate in at best. So especially for a lot of folks that are running in competition classes that have a treadwear limited tire, you may have to walk around the paddock and look at what other people are running, look on forums, and find out. Because your car will have a setting that it'll be effective at, but the tire may like something different.
That's a very good point. The tire will also determine static camber adjustment also.
Definitely. Realistically speaking, though, just like there's 3 suspension types, you're going to have 3 different styles of negative camber setting at that static height. Starting back off again with a strut car, strut cars are going to require the highest static negative camber. For a lot of front-wheel drive race cars, you may see them running like a stance show car at -3, -4 degrees or more. And that may be due to just how much compression is lost or how much camber is lost on compression as that car rolls. For a double wishbone car, usually it may not have much negative camber at static ride height, at static setting. Depends on how fast it gains camber as it compresses. Or if the suspension's very stiff and the car doesn't roll at all, you may see the exact opposite. It may be set at a very high static setting because they're controlling the roll in a different manner. And that leads perfectly into that third one, that multi-link. Multi-link suspensions, again, once you've determined how the car articulates and whether it gains or loses, that'll tell you the median point at which you want to set your static negative camber. Oftentimes, it's less than a strut car, but more than something that has a double A arm. A common myth with camber is that it's going to wear your tires out. This actually isn't the case. Most of the time, even at high negative camber settings of more than -2.5 degrees, it has little or no additional impact on tire wear. The primary adjustment that has an effect on tire wear is toe. If you have toe in or toe out, that will provide much more wear on the tire than a -2.5 degree setting.
That was a really good point. So even on my daily driver that is also my weekend warrior, your static camber setting is still okay on tire wear when I'm just on my everyday commute.
Absolutely. The number one impact you're going to notice from a car that has higher negative camber settings is it will actually have faster turn-in, or it might be slightly darty at freeway speeds. Like if you're crossing a lane line or a junction rise or that bridge, that gap in a set of concrete, the car may skip or drive faster towards that as you're moving. But realistically, as long as you're keeping enough contact patch on the ground that you're not affecting braking in a straight line, there's no reason why you can't run negative camber on a daily driven car. My daily driver was also my weekend autocross championship winning car that ran negative 3.7 degrees of camber. I didn't wear the tires any faster, but I could definitely tell I had a lot less braking potential at the limit than I did before. And that's just because in a straight line, my contact patch was half the tire, as opposed to when the car rolls or when you're in a turn and the rest of that tire is all the way down. Sometimes the best way to find out what the right setting for you is to look at what other people that also have a similar car are running. A lot of folks may find that a specific range is getting you closer and closer to that sweet spot for the car. If you have a unique chassis that not as many people are running, then you're going to have to do a little bit of guess and check. Again, the rule of thumb for measuring effective camber at the track is to actually measure the temperature of the tire, measuring the inner, center, and outer tread blocks to see what the temperature change is. Ideally, it's even across the tire, but that's highly unrealistic most times, especially with things like a strut car that's going to have significant camber changes during dynamic motion. Still, $10 Harbor Freight infrared thermometer and a few seconds in the pit can tell you if you're at least in the ballpark of where your car should be. And it's simple as that, for most vehicles that are seeing street duty use, you're going to run a negative camber setting in the static range of less than 3 degrees. Cars that get used for competition use, that may even see track time with tires as soft as an R compound, can vary widely, 5-6 degrees or more, and it'll depend on the end of the vehicle and the drivetrain. A front-wheel drive vehicle is going to run into a physical limit of camber use. If it doesn't have a contact patch to put power down in a straight line anymore, it's running too much. Conversely, rear-wheel drives have the same issue. If you have the ability to adjust negative camber in rear-wheel drive, again, too much negative camber and you've lost your ability to put power down in anything but a turn.
Thank you for being on the podcast, Tyler. That was a huge amount of information in this short span of time.
Well, I look forward to illuminating a little bit more about chassis setup and what these suspension terms really mean.
All right, so this has been the Annex Suspension podcast on camber change on roll. Thanks again, Tyler.
Thank you. The Annex Suspension podcast is powered by CM Auto House.